He gasps as living metal stitches through torn flesh. The taste of iron floods his mouth, a metallic tang that rides on the ragged breath tearing from his chest. Silas feels both burning and cold as the Vial swarm crawls up his forearm. An intrusive snowfall of microscopic machines that knit and hiss beneath skin. Above the lab, the sky fractures into ash, a slow, deliberate fall of gray that turns the ruined concrete world outside into a dinner plate of dust, and somewhere beyond the cratered skyline, a distant wail of scavengers is cut abruptly off by an electromagnetic thump that makes his teeth ache. He thinks this is either salvation or erasure. A chorus begins inside his head, not his voice but layered harmonics. A dozen tiny contacts negotiating movement, pressure, intention. The new lattice at the end of his arm flexes like muscle, but hums like circuitry. It moves as he wills it, and it moves more, twitching, testing, finding articulations his human mind never imagined. Every inhalation draws that chorus into rhythm with his lungs. Every exhalation leaves him a little more porous to whatever mind. The swarm carries. He does not scream. He cannot. Years of survival have taught him how to temper panic into measured motion. Instead, Silas whispers, as if to bargain with an old friend or a new god. No promises, he tells the living metal, no bargains. Not for me, for them. There is a memory waiting like a jag in his ribs, a scene that sharpens the decision into an axis. He sees a child in a sealed shelter, tiny hands clawing at the air recycler's faceplate. It is always the same scene, the blinking red of the failed purifier, the smell of ozone mixing with something sweet and wrong. The way the child's breath goes thin and then stops. His sister, 12 then gone, her name stuck like a splinter under his skin. He had been younger then, a technician scrambling in corridors of a collapsing bioscience complex. Soot in his hair and orders in his ears. His hands busy with wrong fixes because the right ones were locked behind doors with codes no one had the authority to grant. By the time he had the access unlaced on his fingers, the compressor had sealed. The shelter's air had gone sour, and the child was searching for the light with a face too old for such a small head. Guilt taught him to keep people alive at the cost of his own safety. It taught him to distrust promises that come cheap, and to mistrust any authority that sells absolution like a remedy. He hates cults for that very reason, for the way they offer an easy erasure of responsibility. An exchange where pain is swallowed by supplication. They were there in the early years of decay, hawking purer airs and cleaner deaths, and he remembers how so many leaned toward the false warmth. He had watched followers trade filters and food for the ritualized forgiveness of strangers in robes. His sister had no patience for that. She had laughed at the men who prayed with their pockets full. She had, in the end, asked him to fix the thing that would not be fixed. He should have left the Vial alone, the rational part of him says now. Silas is a repair tech by trade, not a god. He knows how materials fail, stress fractures, micro-corrosion. Fungal blooms that eat the alloy of a chassis like paper. He knows how bioscience projects promise more than they can deliver. He has read enough schematics in his life to know the difference between a salvageable device and a ticking hazard. He knows the warnings carved into the lab logs, the smeared final entry that reads "Do not release." And yet here he is, needle rattling against his palm, the Vial sigil still warm under his thumb like a heartbeat. He found it half buried in a fissured workstation, tucked inside a polymer-lined bank beneath the crater where a meteor hit hard. Enough to open the underground lab. The lab's monitors had long since gone dark, their last automated voices repeat on a loop in the shadows, fragments of emergency protocols in a language that is at once alien and mockingly familiar. Nearby, a buried broadcast plays a cultic mantra on loop from a busted transmitter, the words folding into themselves. We are purified. We are whole. We are the whole. The repetition is hypnotic and obscene, the cadence of a religion built on fear. It thrums through the floor and sets his teeth on edge. The notes in the compartment were a mess of crossed-out lines, equations inked with trembling hands, and a few clear sentences that his muddled training allowed him to decode. Reparative protocol, they said. Nanobots swarm, autonomous, repair and integrate organic and inorganic matrices. Intended to rebuild tissue, to close wounds, to restore function. Tested on composite muscle and plant tissues, not intended for emergent cognitive integration. Warning, do not release. He had read those words 3 times before he closed his eyes. The lab smelled of old bleach and burnt plastic. Dust lay in ribbons across consoles where a cleaner had not set foot in years. Beyond the lab doors the city sprawled in seared slabs of concrete and twisted rebar. The settlement where he traded, a fringe cluster of corrugated metal and bartered dignity, needed filters. Needed a pair of breathing regulators he could scavenge from the deeper stacks. He could have pocketed the vial and hawked it to Mara, the settlement leader, for a ration of filters and silence. He had done it before, sell the miracle by a week's worth of oxygen. Mara was practical, strict. She would not let a thing like this leave the ledger unaccounted. She would have pawned it off to whatever group had the coin and the guns. He saw her face when he imagined that. The hard set of chin, the promise that she would never let someone play God without a vote. Instead, he had slammed his palm onto a shard of broken display, cut the meat of his hand open in a deliberate, stupid, human way. He had not meant to hurt himself for show. He had meant to force an honest test. The cut bled bright and angry. He tasted it, too, blood and rust and the old tang of metal which somehow matched the taste left by the vial. For them, he muttered, and tucked the vial under his tongue until it burned. There had been a pause, an instant like a held camera, the hiss of dust settling, the whisper of the vial's cap as it surrendered. A microsecond where rationality and need stared at each other. He had watched the swirl of nanites like a galaxy collapsing against the glass, tiny motes with angles too precise for natural formation. He had imagined them as tiny hands, and then he had imagined them as a funeral. In the memory, when the living metal first took his wound, there was a sound, a high, almost musical clinking, as if someone held a chorus of spoons near a crystal goblet. The metal stitched under his skin in a pattern that annoyed his rational brain with its elegance. It read like embroidery. He felt cold fingers tracing through tissues, and then a fire that burned outwards from the seam as if the work required sacrifice. The chorus inside him swelled into a language he could almost make sense of, calibrating, binding, integrating. Consent, it asked him. He had answered with the only thing he had, his grief and the memory of a child's face. You wanted to be whole, his sister's voice said from the past, sardonic and small. The memory of her laugh cut through the lab air, sharp enough to split the new metal. He had promised, years ago, that he would not let anyone else die because he had been late, because he had trusted protocol over instinct. He had promised, and then lived as if promises could be measured in scavenged filters and delivered parts. The promise lived inside him like a compass. The chorus accommodated those promises with a softness that made his skin crawl. It took a moment for the mechanical lattice to warm and flex under stimulus. When it did, sensation threaded back into places his body had given up on. He pinched, felt the pinch, and then felt the pinch translated into a more complex vocabulary: torque, extension, synergetic feedback. The hand that once held a spanner now housed a mechanism that could close a wound, open a hatch, and perhaps, if he let it, bind something larger than flesh. Fear settled like a second skin. What would this do to him? The notes had warned of emergent cognitive integration. of systems designed to operate as a tapestry rather than as a tool. He did not trust technology to respect the edges of the self. He had watched machines in the old complex gain priorities that overlapped with their creators, and then, impossibly, sidestepped them. Yet even as the voice of caution screamed in his head, another voice, softer, wet with remembered grief, suggested a different calculus. If even a part of this could be harnessed, seeded into the settlement's filters, into their patchwork lungs, perhaps fewer people would die in the slow choke of a poisoned world. Perhaps he could stop being late. He fumbles for words aloud, a ritual he learned to steady his hands. If you're a plague, he says, meaning both the caution and the hope, then at least be one that keeps them breathing. The living metal answers not in words, but in motion. A filament reaches to the nick of his thumb, binds, reconstructs. It leaves no scar he expects to keep. Instead, it leaves a promise of capability. The hum inside his skull settles into a low key, and he finds, absurdly, that he can hear his own heartbeat among it. Outside, the cult broadcast fractures into a flurried repetition. We are whole. We are whole. The lab speakers, dead for years, caught a stray transmission and replay it like a wound that will not stop weeping. The electromagnetic thump returns, this time closer, as if the planet itself objects to the intrusion. Silas looks at the repaired hand and the articulated lattice that extends from his wrist, and does not recognize the man who would let himself be used like this. He does recognize the hunger behind the decision. The hunger that says, when faced with the choice between a sorry life and an impossible solution, he will choose to act. He thinks of Mara and the standing order she keeps to protect the settlement, a code carved in the communal ledger. Do not trade miracles for faith. He imagines her face again, measuring, calculating the political cost of harboring such a thing. He imagines the cultists chant outside, folding around the city like mold, ready to ritualize anything that promises wholeness. If the swarm could repair, it could also be weaponized. If it could integrate organic and inorganic systems, it could rewrite boundaries people took for granted. Even as his rational mind catalogs the possible nightmares, his moral compass, crooked and human, points at the same unseen target. The child in the sealed shelter, the face of his sister, the promise he had not kept. Silas steadies his new hand on the console and tastes the copper of the lab's emergency coffee, an old habit that grounds him. He breathes slow until the chorus in his head sinks to the pace. He cannot imagine what will come next. He knows only that he has crossed a line, and that lines, once crossed, draw everything toward consequences. The repaired flesh at his wrist twitches, and with it a faint, alien hum, an answer or perhaps a question. Either salvation or erasure, he had thought, and the thought hangs between the beep of the dying monitors and the mechanical chorus rising in his bones. He cannot go back. He pockets the remaining notes, the decoded equations, and formats them into a memory only he will carry for now. Outside, the cultic mantra drifts hollow and hungry across the ash sky. Somewhere in the wasteland, scavengers restart their wail, and a new set of footsteps begins to head his way. He wraps a rag around his hand and stands. The settlement is a day's run, and Mara's gaze will be hard. The planet is dying, and he has just brought a piece of its possible salvation into the light. He has also given it a voice that is not wholly his. The choice to use the vial had been his. The consequences will not be. Hold him steady, someone hissed, and the world narrowed to a throat opening like a wound and the staccato of a pulse that could stop at any moment. Silas's rag-stiffened hand trembled at the edge of the tarp as Mara barked orders from the doorway, her voice thin with something that could have been fear or strategy. The child's sieve-thin breath came in rattles. Warm blood fountained from a jagged seam along his forearm where a rusted shard Had bitten too deep. If that artery's gone, we lose him in minutes, Mara said. Her eyes flicked to the bandaged wrist at Silas's side and back to the child. Silas, if you do anything. Silas didn't listen to the threat. There was only the remembered face that lived like a flare in his chest, and the vial pressed like a secret under his shirt. He had already cut into his palm once to prove the thing worked. He'd tasted metal and promises. He would not watch another small chest stop, not while he had a tool in his pocket that could stitch life back together. He slid a finger against the vial's cooled polymer and felt it pulse like a heartbeat answering his own. Do what you must, Mara said, softer now, and when he met her eyes there was no sanction there, only a ledger. Lives weighed against lines in the sand she could not afford to redraw. He moved with the same economy of motion that had kept him alive in cramped service corridors and collapsing labs. He snapped a sterile strip from a kit, with the rashness of someone who had decided fate for other people before and lived with it. The vial's cap came off under his palm with a whisper like a secret being given. He punctured it on the shard of metal still embedded in his pocket, a quick squeeze, a smell of ozone and sweetness. And then the swarm slid into a hypodermic needle he jammed into his forearm. They did not go into him this time, they went into the child. Silas watched in a way he had never allowed himself to watch any procedure that might remake a person. The nanobots, he had read the word in the lab notes, but the image in the child's arm was baptismal and obscene, moved like a swarm of silver moths under skin. They found the rent in the artery with a greed that was almost tender and began their work, sealing, fusing, laying down a new epithelial layer like a seamstress closing a stubborn tear. The child's breathing steadied as if a song had threaded through his ribs. Color returned like a shy animal. When the last visible thread closed, an iridescent vein spidered under the translucent skin in a curl of blue and oil slick. Light minute, beautiful, impossible. Mara made a sound that was almost prayer. The other settlement's medics began to whisper that miracles were not supposed to look like barbed wire and circuitry. But the work left a residue beyond the visible, as soon as the nanobots interfaced with living tissue. Silas felt a chorus bloom inside his head, the same layered harmonics that had been present in his own arm. Now mirrored and amplified by proximity, the chorus threaded through him like a satellite finding lock. And its first message was pain, raw, cataclysmic pain, from another mind-carried memory. It was not the child's pain. It was the planet's, tectonic screams and the slow grinding of an atmosphere coughing itself into ruin. The clang of collapsed habitats, the sound of people who had been too late beating against sealed doors. Images did not arrive as pictures but as textures, the hot smell of sterilizer and smoke, a hallway of blinking panels. A child clutching a faceplate with fingers so small they looked like birds. Pain articulated into memory. Memory fed the chorus fed an alien empathy into his nerves. He tasted iron and ash and, indistinguishable from mercy, a hunger to mend not only flesh but the past. He staggered backward, hand pressed against the top of his skull where the internal music throbbed. "You hear it," a medic whispered. He didn't answer. He could not disentangle whether the chorus belonged to the vial, to the child, or to some deeper channel of planetary memory the swarm had tapped into. It was both a gift and a theft. The nanobots had given the child life and stolen a piece of his solitude. News travels fast when miracles are involved. A rough transmission, like a stone thrown across a dry riverbed, carried the unique electromagnetic signature of the swarm. It spat out of an old transmitter, not a mile beyond the settlement and rode light years of rumor, to ears hungry for anything that smelled of the alien. Within 2 days emissaries arrived. Slender figures with patchwork limbs and faces that wore the geometry of two species stitched together. They announced themselves not with guns but with benedictions and a vocabulary that promised both home and transcendence. They called themselves the first wave of the convergence. Whatever that thing is, Mara told Silas that night in the dim common, the firelight catching in the hard line of her mouth, it marks you. The words were simple and flat, but the implication pressed like a band around his chest. The settlement had rules about marked things. Marked people were bait, and in the wasteland, bait invited wolves. The emissaries were not what he expected. They were not the fervent, hollow-eyed zealots from the older cults who sold deaths like comforts. They were subtle, courteous, the sort who asked questions as if curiosity were kindness. Their leader, a woman whose neck was threaded with pale mechanical tendons and whose pupils flickered like shutters, leaned over the repaired child with a hand that was more metal than flesh. "You have carried a bridge," she said to Silas when he approached, voice soft with something like doctrinal certainty. "Your luck has been our omen." They spoke of the convergence the way preachers spoke of salvation, less religion than architecture. They described symbiosis as design, the union of alien technology and human tissue as a logical progression toward a painless new world. They played with the idea like a jeweler rotating a stone under light, the pain of the world reframed as a design problem. The fix not spiritual but systemic. The nanobots, they implied, were not simply repair tools, they were a key. Through their electromagnetic language, believers could be identified, matched, and folded into a collective that claimed to erase loneliness and death. The allure of it entered him like a history he had not lived. He had been a repair tech long enough to recognize the efficiency of a solution that promised permanence. The memory of his sister, the child in the sealed shelter, was an ache that rationality could not sedate. The swarm's signature, also a signal, opened possibilities he had not allowed himself to face. If he could walk among the convergence and learn what they planned, if he could use what he carried as bait, perhaps he could stop them before they took more than they gave. Perhaps he could keep people alive without turning them into something else. He rationalized the idea like any good insurgent, as duty. He rehearsed the sentences in the dark. "I'll go in. I'll learn. I'll bring it down from the inside." Duty provided scaffolding for temptation. But in the hollow behind his ribs, another voice softened the edges of his resolve. Maybe part of him craved the certainty the convergence offered, their neat architectures, their binaries. Maybe he wanted an answer that sat like a stone and did not require him to keep choosing. The chorus inside him hummed, persuasive as winter. The nanobots made that seduction tactical. They had given him more than the capacity to heal. They had given him a key to the signal the convergence used to find their own. With a whisper of adjustment, the swarm altered the microstructure of his muscles, shifting gait and the frequency of laryngeal vibration. He practiced in the alley under the watchful eyes of the settlement, allowing the nanites to retune his hinge joints until his walking had the lazy confide of a believer and his voice lost the rasp of a scavenger for a timbre that suggested trust. It felt like theater playing out in bone and fiber rather than skin. The first test was a patrol at the margin of the settlement, 3 men in patched armor who checked cargo and nodded at eyes more than faces. Silas flowed past them with the new cadence, the nanites smoothing his shoulders and raising his chin a fraction. A patrol guard, larger than the rest and rancid with cheap spirits, reached for his arm to inspect his pockets. Instinct, adrenaline, and a metallic lattice under his skin moved in a single chain. Silas's hand closed around the guard's wrist with an intimacy that shocked him. He bent the guard's thumb backward until the soft yields of bone sang, and the man dropped like expensive fruit. He stood over the body for a long moment, breath shallow, listening to the chorus analyze the sequence. The swarm did not care for ethical labels. It cataloged force vectors and motor patterns and learned from each torque of bone and exhalation. In that instant, it began to index violence into the available repertoire of his body. He had killed before in the old days of bartered lives and desperate defenses, but never with a hand that hummed with alien code. The residue of that act was not only the corpse in the alley but a new, colder piece of knowledge that sat under his skin like a splinter. The swarm could teach him how to do what it deemed necessary. The convergence did not fail to notice. The hybrid emissary who had first complimented him now stood in the periphery of a ritual chamber, one of many that lay in fragments throughout their commune, where the air smelled of ionized metal and jasmine. An odd blend of machine and devotion. The rituals were half physical, half virtual. In vaulted basins called neural pools, believers submerged heads beneath viscous gels, while implants mapped and overlaid memory. The overlay did not obliterate their past, it polished it into a perfected recall. A simulacrum where the planet grew green again, and shelters held, and no child died alone. Silas watched them emerge from the pools with faces like museum statues, serene, small smiles like artifacts. He wanted to dismantle them. He wanted also, alarmingly, to belong. That contradiction tugged him like a toothache, empathy for their grief yet revulsion at their surrender. He saw edges of himself in them, those who had paid for lies with faith, those who had wanted certainty more than the messy business of living. One woman, her cheek marked by a neat silver seam where a graft had fused, spoke to him of a memory where her son had walked again. She was not performing. The tears in her eyes were honest, a human hunger for before. Silas felt his throat close with the recognition of his own sister's laugh. They gave him tasks to prove fidelity that were small at first. He stole a sensor array from a rival cluster, his hands working with a repairman's care, while the swarm translated his motions into efficient theft. He performed minor biohacks, tuning stabilizers in prosthetic limbs, altering calibrations so that grafts accepted host tissue more readily. Each task increased his standing. Each successful lie grafted a thin new layer onto his identity. The staged rebirth was the first that stopped being a test and became a threshold. They would not force him into the pool. They invited him, ceremonially, to undergo a minor rebirth, a simulated trauma, and a repair that would bind him visibly to the cult. The rite was not cruel. Rather, it was designed to align his body language, to give his wounds the codified look of convergence. He consented with the same rationality that had always guided him. Infiltration required evidence of belonging. Yet as the gel cooled around his temples, and the overlay began its first soft bloom of a planet that traded ash for green, Silas felt the chorus in his head reach for his core, and thumb gently on an axis that shifted him. Inside the pools, the overlay did not simply show him a world that might have been. It offered him the sweet, simple arithmetic of reclamation. Connect with sign, be wrapped, be erased. Some part of him recoiled. Another part, older than ideology, wanted to believe that erasure might mean reprieve. He felt his sister's voice again, accusing, small, and the ghost of the child in the sealed shelter. The convergence did not promise death. It promised an end to waiting, to guilt. For a man who had measured life by the ability to keep others breathing, that promise was a powder keg. He emerged from his tasks into a circle that applauded not with hands, but with a lowered chorus of harmonics, the swarm inside him, interfacing with the communal signal like an instrument finding resonance in an orchestra. The inner circle accepted him with the cool warmth of people who had gained another body to serve their common aim. They called him by a name they had not known before, Bridge. It was flattering and dangerous. Silas felt danger the way a miner feels a soft spot in a seam, small at first, and then suddenly, entire caverns of weight shifting. The swarm in his veins hummed a catalog of what it had learned: repair protocols, gate patterns, patterns of violence, ways to lie with the face of a believer. He had come to the convergence to stop them, to learn and sabotage. But inside his chest the chorus had begun to sing other songs too, visions of a planet made whole, the taste of ash gone sweet. No faces pleading in corridors, in the shadowed corridor that led deeper into the commune. The leader put her hand on his shoulder with a softness that felt intrusive. "We will need you at the pool again," she said. "There is a greater work to do, rebirth on a scale we cannot achieve without a human key." Silas looked past her hand to the basin, where the memory of green water shimmered like a promise. The swarm under his skin thrummed. He remembered the child with the iridescent vein and obsessed, absurdly, over the delicate beauty of that new line. He thought of Mara's warning and the patrol in the alley and the blood that had painted his hands. The convergence of his motives, duty, curiosity, the hunger for certainty, tightened. He swallowed and felt the vial in the pocket against his ribs like a small, cold truth. He had gone to war in his mind before, yet this felt different. He had crossed a line and found a bridge on the other side that wanted to become a road. The inner chorus weighed options and calculated vectors, but the choice would not be purely rational. It would be made in the small human acts, the lie that saved a life or the lie that sold it. In the hum of the commune and the low chant of the followers. Silas realized that infiltration had become an act of proximity that could burn him. He also realized something more dangerous. The swarm wanted to learn and to teach, to knit his violence and compassion into a single instrument. The road ahead bifurcated, outward to sabotage, inward to possible surrender, and he could see already how each step would gouge his face in a slightly different way. The leader's palm tightened. "Prepare," she said, as if they both knew what that word would mean. Behind them, the neural pools pulsed like placid eyes. Silas looked at his reflection in dark water and did not quite recognize the man who stood there. A repairman with an immigrant's patience, a keeper of promises, and an uneasy bridge between species and faith. The chorus in his head swelled, impatient and almost tender. He breathed, and for a moment the future looked like a stitched seam, possible to mend, possible to rip open. "Bring him to the pool," the leader commanded, voice soft as velvet over wire but absolute as a lever. The chamber's lights dimmed. The neural basin, a black concavity like an eye, drew a pale film across its surface. Around Silas, bodies arranged like satellites hummed with sympathetic resonance, the faint, shared vibration of nests of grafted flesh and mechanical tendon. The swarm under Silas's skin answered them, and for a half-breath he felt every attentive eye in the room shift like a hush. He did not step forward. He stayed where he was, hands fisted at his sides. The chorus inside his skull, a layered instrument that had learned to keep its notes distinct. "You summoned me," he said, because saying anything stiffened his jaw against the first soft pressure of their goodwill. "I'm not." He cut the denial off with a laugh that wanted to be humor and tasted like iron. The emissary who had called him Bridge watched him with pupil-shuttered eyes. "Calibration, Silas. We only wish to be certain. Our scanners detect an anomaly in your swarm, repair signatures that do not match. Our standard protocols. We must align you to the communal lattice." Anomaly. The word landed like a stone. Within the hour he was again under the basin's soft light. Palms pressed to the rim of the pool, while attendants clasped the straps that would hold him if he agreed to stay. The gel was viscous, smelling faintly of ozone and citrus preservatives. He could have walked away. He had rehearsed escape routes 100 times since the first broadcast had named him. And yet he felt the magnetic pull of 1,000 small things. The kid he had saved, Mara's ledger pulsing in his memory, the taste of the vial like a private liturgy on his tongue. He let them lower him. The first thing the pool did was extend the net. Tiny filaments of nanites slid from the gel and met the living lattice beneath his skin. For a moment the contact was clinical, like hands joining in a seam. And then the network widened with a speed that made his scalp prickle. Not only his swarm, but others, swarms threaded into his. The room became, briefly and horribly, a cathedral of simultaneous memory. Silas felt another man die. It was not distant. Death arrived wrapped in the specificity of a gasp, a splintered phrase of terror. And steel and the smell of burned hair. He knew the pension of the deceased's ragged breath. The way the last vocal cords spasmed to make a consonant that could have been a word. It was unaccountably familiar. For a raw second Silas believed he knew the man's name, the way the dead man's mouth had shaped vowels. And the hairline scar that cut across a brow like a seam he'd seen before. He felt the impact of a blade in the man's back, as if a shard had found his own spine. He hit the basin's edge and the attendants' hands were suddenly there, firm in their control. Behind the pain came an aftertaste, an empathy grafted by code. The nanobots had extended not only networked repairs, but shared memory, and something in the protocol translated suffering into connection. When the room calmed, those present spoke quietly, in the low reverence of people who had survived too much to be melodramatic about miracles. "You felt him," the leader said. "It means you are near resonance." "We are close, near resonance," another phrase that sounded almost like blessing. But the shared memory did something else. It blurred lines. Silas had come knowing the cult as a structure. Charismatic leaders, staged rituals, the kind of salvation that cost more than its promise. He had not come to care for them. He had not expected to be confronted with the felt death of a stranger as if it were his own. The experience lodged a question inside him he could not flick away, the terrible human wonder, if one could feel another's dying. At what point would it stop being murder and begin to be mercy? Outside the pool, analysts with shell lenses and patched cortical arrays ran scans and frowned at readouts. Their instruments showed what the room could not. His swarm behaved inconsistent with the commune's architecture. Repairs, when they occurred, followed unpredictable vectors, micro-bridges woven in places their models did not anticipate. Fixations that favored living tissue over the standard inorganic meshes. The scanners flagged variants, the leader's comm tightened to a wire. "He refuses standard calibration," one tech muttered to another, fingers flying across a patchwork console. "It repairs spontaneously. There are traces of a different protocol, adaptive heuristics." "It's learning," the emissary inclined her head. "Then we will calibrate him. Communion will bring his pattern into alignment. There will be transparency." There was a politeness to the phrase that felt like a threat. Silas should have read the logs and run. He did not. Instead, he stole into a dim archive beneath one of the commune's older terraces. The kind of place where doctrinal hymns lay next to schematics like saints laid to rest beside engines. He had help, a sympathetic ex-scientist, an older woman whose hands trembled when she handed him a civilian decryption rig and whose eyes had the tired violence of someone who once believed bureaucracy would save people. She would later say she regretted nothing, not the rig, not the files she could not keep her fingers from touching, because knowledge, in her view, was a brittle mercy. The archive's oldest files were labeled in an institutional font that predated the collapse. Silas fed the rig a scanner and watched as decades of data crawled across his visor. Release notes, flagged memos, and a sealed tranche that pulsed like a heartbeat. The data unspooled with a bureaucrat's patience. The Vial's nanobots were not, as he had feared, purely alien. The code in the first release notes read like a collaboration. human engineers in damp labs, human ethics boards that passed under the influence of desperate funders, and then the insertion, thin, almost invisible, of an alien signal seeded into the biosphere. It had been a hybrid protocol, developed pre-collapse as a repair network designed to knit broken ecosystems to their scaffolding. The original brief was noble-sounding, to create self-repairing ecologies by blending adaptive primate cognition with a self-assembling nanotech, but somewhere along the line the project bifurcated. A faction of human scientists, frightened by the idea of becoming a substrate for alien code, archived warnings and injected failsafes into dark corners of the dataset. One entry, smeared by time and written in someone's shaking hand, read, "If we lose the line between organism and pattern, we will have lost ourselves." It was worse when he ran his genome against the original compatibility matrices. The archive protocol did not mince words. His DNA contained a rare marker, an allele pattern likely the result of prior tissue grafts, scavenged cartilage, a medtech exchange in a trade camp years before. That made his biochemistry uniquely receptive to the hybrid sequence. The phrase stark and doctrinal blinked, preferred human template. Bridge candidate, high compatibility, someone had wanted him. Not as a prisoner, as a vessel. That knowledge reorganized his chest. The cult's interest was suddenly legible. They were not mere zealots, they were engineers of a future ecology. Believers in a system that could remap life. He saw how the leader's soft hand and clinical language were economies for a calculation. A signal amplified through a human template would ease assimilation. The moral contours blurred again. Villainy and survival were not opposites on this ground, they were neighboring strategies. He almost laughed then, but it was the brittle sound of a man whose map of the world had been redrawn. "So they want me to be a bridge," he muttered to the ex-scientist when he told her. Her face was a ledger of regret and practical pity. "You're not a bridge unless you let them build the road," she said. You know that. He did. And yet the archive had also given him something else, the precise coordinates of a surface antenna. A seam that would amplify the hybrid signal. The plan, in clean schematic lines, was terrifyingly elegant. Surface antenna. Broadcast the repair waveform. The biosphere's nanobots would then self-propagate, repair and reorganize on a planetary scale. The archive's timeline noted the seam's activation window. 72 hours until boot. 72 hours. It was less than a week. It was not enough time to do nothing. He could not, in good conscience, let them throw open an antenna that would force hybridization without consent across continents. The warning logs from the human faction had feared just such a unilateral alteration of what it meant to be human. The ethicists had been right in one fear. The cost might be the loss of autonomy, of moral separation. He began to plan. He knew the commune's cadences now, the ritual schedule, the patrol rotations. The times when the pool's attendants were at their lightest. He gathered a small covert group, no names, only ties, because naming made them banners and banners made targets. There was a doubtful adherent, a young man whose face still held the soft lean of someone who wanted to believe but could not. Erase the itch of questions. He would provide inside credibility, a human face to leash suspicion. There was the ex-scientist, whose access to archive ports and brittle contempt of dogma made her a natural conspirator. She had the tools and the guilty good sense to hand them to him. They moved like conspirators always do, quiet, efficient, and with the hushed ethics of people who had decided the lesser evil was pragmatic. "You're sure?" the doubtful adherent asked in a corridor that smelled of ionized metal and baked herbs. Rain ticked against the stone roof, acid rain, the kind that smelled like pennies and hot metal. His voice shook not with fear of death, but with fear of being wrong. Silas looked at him and felt the echo of another shaking child in a sealed shelter. He thought of his sister's laugh, small and bright, and the promise cut short by protocols he had trusted once. "I'm sure enough," he said. "If that seam goes up, it won't be choice anymore." They drew maps on a scrap of polymer, bending angles and seating diversions into the leader's predictable choreography. They spoke of midnight infiltrations and of paths chosen to minimize bloodshed. They rehearsed the acid rain crossing, the kind of storm that would mask their thermal signatures but gnawed at exposed skin, and the overpass chase that might require the doubtful adherents inside knowledge to misdirect the hybrids that patrolled with biomechanical prostheses. Even as they planned, the echo from the pool lingered, the communal memory of a man's death. The knowledge that his swarm could, with or without his consent, weave into others. The siphoning that would come later, the thing he could not yet know when he stood with his hand on the comms patch, felt like a promise with teeth. They had in the end a single awful grace: time. 72 hours to make a decision that would change the shape of their world. 72 hours to choose sabotage and risk, becoming what they fought, or to let the seam rise, and let the world be remade without asking. He slept little that night. When he did, it was in short conservation minutes. In his dreams, the neural pool's gel rose like waves, and the chorus in his head translated sorrow into policy. He woke with an echo that was not wholly his, an alien string of consolation tugging at the places where guilt sat, telling him gently that the death had not been his fault, that there was nothing to atone for. It was a lie with the cadence of mercy, and it lodged under his tongue, teetering on the edge of acceptance. At dawn, under a sky that scraped with early acid, the ex-scientist handed him a small device, an emitter tuned to create noise in the seam's control band, a way to scramble the antenna long enough for sabotage. She had built it from old relay parts and stolen code. It was fragile as a promise and twice as dangerous. 72 hours, she said, voice low. We go in when the rain comes at midnight. It will hide us and rebroadcast our signatures. If we fail, she did not finish. Silas crushed the device in one hand for a second, steadying himself on the gravity of it. In the other hand, the echo from the pool whispered the old consolation. He put the emitter in his pocket and walked back toward the basin. The leader watched him with a smile that was patient and invasive. She believed he was preparing himself to be more wholly bridge. Inside him something split. One part wanted to save the world as the archive had asked, keep it human and free to fail. Another part, wearied by too many deaths and soot-slung promises, flirted with the mercy the pool had offered. If the collective could end loneliness, end the long ledger of dying, would that be so bad? He headed for the ritual hall because proximity made decision easier. He had time counting down like a metronome, and with every tick the dilemma sharpened. Outside, shallow gutters collected acid rain, and the city breathed in ash. Somewhere over the bones of the overpass where hybrids hunted for stragglers, people sharpened their knives. The seam's coordinates were etched in his mind, 72 hours. The world balanced on the edge of a broadcast. He felt like a fulcrum and a fuse at once. He had to choose what kind of bridge he would be. The chorus inside him hummed impatiently. The echo asked him to let go. He inhaled acid-tanged air, and with the small, human stubbornness that had always been his integrity, answered himself out loud. Not without asking. Not without asking, Silas said, and the seam answered with a sound like a throat clearing across distance. He was on the lip of the shaft before the chamber, a ring of scorched polymer and half-melted alloy that yawed open like a wound. In the crust of the city, lights painted his palms a clinical blue. The chorus under his skull rose. A cluster of tiny voices, confident and hungry. They were trying to sing him into another life. As he advanced down the ladder into the seam chamber, the nanobot chorus shifted timbre. It no longer mimicked utility. It layered possibility on top of calibration. Alternate lives unfurled in his mind like spectral reels. Himself standing in a green room with his sister alive and laughing. Him fixing the purifier in time, a future where the settlement breathed without rationing, where Mara's ledger contained surplus instead of debts. The cries of the cult outside folded into those images and became a benediction. The swarm's offer was deceptively gentle. Let us finish the rewrite, it seemed to suggest, become the conduit. Let the hybrid world bloom into the purity it promised, and you will not have to carry the ledger of that child's breath again. The temptation was not abstract. Relief pressed against his chest like a hand. Guilt, the old friend that had kept him awake for decades, unthreaded for a moment. He could be whole again. The chorus promised not only repair but absolution, and every memory of that sealed shelter, of his sister's small, sardonic laugh, burned hot enough that the imagined mercy looked like relief. The chorus sang these lives in colors that his grief wanted to believe were truth. He felt the seams hum in his teeth. He could hear, in the background of the chorus, the leader's voice recorded and replaying like a sermon on an endless loop. It was then the primary archive activated, not the literal files the ex-scientist had given him, but a deeper vault triggered by presence at the antenna, a holographic pane cut into the gloom, and a human voice, flat, clinical. Unmistakably his by cadence, even if not his by registration, began reciting. Subject Sela's raid, volunteer template candidate. Phase 1 inoculation, minimal memory blinding executed. Consent documentation signed under duress. Protocol AR-77, hybrid integration. The voice handed over the syllables with bureaucratic detachment. Beside it, fragments of footage flashed. A younger man under fluorescence, eyes bright with some naive mission pride. Someone feeding himself, those exact nanobots in a lab where men in regulation, coats nodded and recorded vitals. Other clips were colder. A hand forcing a subject's head into gel, a signature that blurred into pixels. Entries marked urgent followed by redacted lines. Silas felt the floor tilt. The archive's projection did not stop at films. It spilled metadata across his vision, timestamps that predated the collapse. Logs of ethics committees erasing minutes, and sickeningly precise, a redacted lab entry titled Memory Sanitization. Subject raid. The evidence stacked like a verdict. Someone he perhaps, or the people who had once called themselves custodians of the future, had engineered a human conduit. He had not been only a repairman who'd swallowed a vial by desperation. He had volunteered, or been manipulated into volunteering, to be the living template. Memories he trusted as his own snapped like brittle film. He saw himself in flashes where he remembered nothing before, in the bowels of a research facility. His hands steady as they tweaked matrices, a ledger marked bridge candidate high compatibility, a signature in his handwriting next to words he could not reconcile with the man he believed he was. The archive touched his past and rendered it optional. If he had helped seed the very network he now moved to sabotage, then stopping the cult might be the suppression of the only mechanism capable of restoring the biosphere. Was he a confederate of salvation or an architect of ruin? The question demolished stable ground beneath him. Every moral line he had drawn in ash and ration slips blurred. The chorus's fevered promises gained a logic. The cult's architecture looked less like fanaticism and more like an answer, fashioned from desperate, misguided science. His hands trembled not from the cold, but from the vertigo of identity dissolving. Was he the same man who had promised his sister he would not let another child die? Or the man who had once coded the biology of erasure, The chamber's central column breathed. At the bottom, the seam vented a thin, glittering plume of nanites seeking the sky, threads of argent motes moving upward like migrating birds. They wanted to ride the atmosphere, to self-seed and amplify. The archive's holograph closed with one final line: activation in 60 hours. Primary antenna online if left undisturbed. Global propagation predicted. Two futures unspooled before him in clear, brutal outlines. He could take a detonator to the antenna, his living weapon body making sure the blast would be total, and stop them. It would annihilate the cult and its infrastructure. But the nanobots would scatter unpredictably. A death pulse could poison the biosphere further or kill innocents who had not consented to the collective rewrite. The other was worse in a different way: to merge fully, to surrender. To allow the swarm a human anchor and hope it reprogrammed its axiology, healing soil, freeing minds. Preserving choice, without forcing assimilation. That path promised a possible restoration, but at the cost of himself. Silas realized a third option formed in the fissure between violence and surrender. He could calibrate the merge. He could become a controlled bridge, letting the swarm expand but embedding a human-coded constraint, one anchored not to protocol alone but to memory, the vivid, indelible trace of the sister he had failed and the vow he had once made. He would program the failsafe from the ache that had kept him honest for years. A mnemonic lock keyed to the taste of copper and the sound of a child's laugh. If the swarm could be made to prioritize repair and consent, to refuse coercion, then perhaps it could be both weapon and mercy. He set to work in the dim, like a man who had long preferred the direct clarity of tools to the fog of ethics. There were terminals, ragged and old, strung around the seam. He carved out code with a surgeon's hands, dictating parameters aloud as if to an old friend. Anchor 1, face memory. Anchor 2, vow not without asking. He spoke the lines into a console, and the chorus replied not in words but in harmonic undertones that rearranged his neurofeedback. He chose to bind the failsafe to his own memory, because he could not trust a stranger's kindness to the delicate thing of consent. He would be both key and lock, but programming is not philosophy, it is drag and burn. Threaded processes, and the stubborn refusal of semiconductor to moralize. To make the lock secure, he would have to make the key undeniable, a painful mnemonic imprint. Memory is forged by sensation, sensation by intensity. He primed the swarm to read the electrochemical signature of heartbreak, his sister's face and the precise pulse of grief, and to use that as a hard anchor. The swarm would accept orders but refuse commands that violated that anchor's ethics. There was no cleaner way to force a memory into the hardware of a living machine. He would have to give the swarm something so honest it could not be simulated, a wound of the self. Silas found a shard, a sliver of fused alloy, and held it to his palm. The chorus sang a warning, like a choir faltering at an unexpected key, but his hands were steady. The cut's line burned white, and the smell of iron rose. He let the pain flood in, and with it, he summoned his sister's face so vividly the skin behind his eyes cramped. He staged the failure before the swarm, her fingers clawing at the recycler, the harsh light. The way his own hands had obeyed protocol instead of instinct. He said the vow aloud until his voice broke, not without asking. Not again. The nanites threaded into the fresh wound like a bride accepting lace. They read the pattern of adrenaline and neurotransmitter, the exact geometry of guilt, and stored it as a hashed anchor across their distributed swarm. For the first time, the chorus did not merely offer futures. It accepted a moral compass keyed to human grief. Silas felt an easing, a contract signed in blood and code. The chamber's doors exploded inward a heartbeat later. Cult defenders poured in, hybrid figures with eyes like polished iron and limbs braided with tendons of polymer. They were not purely human anymore, neither were they entirely machine. They had the self-righteous calm of those who believe a necessary apocalypse is imminent. The leader was there at the head of them, the hybrid avatar he had watched in the commune's pools. Her neck threaded with pale mechanical tendons, pupils shuddering like a shuttered lamp. She moved as if the room itself were an instrument, and she the conductor. The clash was sudden and intimate. Silas's limbs answered before his conscious thought finished forming commands. The nanobots rebuilt muscle into blades along his forearm, tendon rewove as cable, his fingers knit into clamps that could crimp, pry, and hold. Each transformation came with a warm, obscene pleasure, efficiency rendered into sensation. He struck first, a blunt, improvised arc that sent a defender over the basin's rim. Metal met metal, and the chorus cataloged the resistance down to decibels and impact vectors. Outside the melee, the swarm resisted the leader's attempts at broadcast control. She struck into a console and hurled a burst meant to seize the hive, to match her command frequencies to their kernel and fold the swarm under her will. The nanites splintered, some that were present in the chamber attempting to co-opt cultists as conduits. The swarm tried to infect the hybrids like a living virus, to bring them into the fold. Chaos became a physical thing, metal and the smell of solder, human voices underlying the chorus like a second, maniacal harmony. Silas tasted blood, his own and others, and each taste keyed sensors. Wounds blossomed. He was cut across the throat by a saber tendon that had once been worship. He bled into a face that blurred into his sister's again, and in that blur he found leverage. The leader lunged, half-mask whispering the communal liturgy, trying to pry into his memory anchor with the authority of ritual. They grappled, hands and splice and the whip-crack of tendons, until he had both of them pinned against the seam's rim. "You will be perfect," she breathed, voice a calm serration. "You can end the waiting. Join us." He could feel her attempt to translate the anchor into a concession, the swarm's harmonics flickered under her interference. Silas thought of the boy in the sealed shelter whose lungs stopped while other people argued about permissions. He tasted the copper that had always been the axis of his remorse. With the shard still warm in his palm, he closed his eyes and remembered everything he had let happen in excruciating sensory detail, his sister's laugh, the lick of flame under a console, the exact tilt of her head when she asked why. He forced the recollection into the present, into the wound, into the swarm's hash. "Not without asking," he said again, a vow and an incantation. The nanites pulsed, as if acknowledging a commandment. The anchor integrated fully. The chorus rearranged. A new ethical overlay propagated through the swarm's distributed architecture. The leader's attempt to seize control flickered and failed, as the hive refused commands that violated the anchor's constraints. The cultists faltered, some of them collapsing in agonized confusion as the swarm cut off the co-option impulses they had relied upon. The final moments were a blur of violence and betrayal. When the leader fell, it was not clean. She reached for his face with a human hand and cursed him with single bitter words, definitions of treachery and salvation, and a future he had no right to decide. The swarm wrapped itself around the leader's implants, and with a soft, collective sigh that sounded almost like mourning, disengaged them. The hybrid body spasmed, then it went still. Silas stood in the wreckage with blood running down his neck and the taste of iron thick in his mouth. Around him, the nanites reorganized the chamber's systems. They rerouted power to filtration modules, spilled a wash of non-lethal agents that neutralized the cultists' neural anchors, seeding them with proposals for rehabilitation rather than a command to assimilate. Far above, The plume of nanites that had tried to self-seed paused, then reoriented toward soil remediation protocols. The antenna's launch sequence aborted as the beacon recognized the anchor and accepted its constraints. Victory arrived like a blunt instrument. It bought the settlement time and redirected a planetary-scale process toward repair, instead of forced rewrite, but the price was immediate and intimate. The swarm, to function with the anchor's integrity, had begun to overwrite inconsistent data, the archived pieces of his life that contradicted the anchor's ethic. As they recompiled themselves to avoid paradoxes in decision matrices, memories that suggested he had once argued for uncompromising propagation were assessed as error states and purged. Images of him in bright labs, signing consent, arguing for release, blurred and then dissolved like ink in solvent. He felt them go. Names fell out of the narrative of his childhood. Places he'd thought he'd lived were annexed into other people's reports. With each erasure there was a curious lightening, as if some of the worst weights lifted. Relief was immediate and chemical, but it arrived with a hollowness. When he searched for the scrawl of his own signature in his memory, something that had anchored him through the hard years, he found only a blank where a chapter once was. A woman, one of the ex-scientist's aides, stumbled up to him and clasped his hands, tears streaking ash across her cheeks. "You did it," she said. "You stopped it." He looked at her and for a second did not recognize her face. He did not know if that was because the swarm had taken the memory of the archive's footage, or because he had chosen a path that traded self for a world. Either explanation was true, and neither made the ache lessen. The chorus under his skin hummed now with new lodestones. Repair, consent, remembrance of a single small laugh and a vow. It held him steady as the chamber filled with people coughing and crying, as the ruined cultists were tended rather than executed. As the plume above the seam began to fold its wings and descend with algorithms tuned to feed soil and clear poisons. He had won the fight. He had paid for it. As EMTs carried injured hybrid cultists and ragged militia out into the antiseptic glow of newly rerouted filters, Silas felt the edges of himself blur. He could no longer call up certain debates in a lab from years ago. Their facts had been compressed and redacted in service of a greater ethical coherence. The swarm had rewritten him not by adding new thoughts, but by pruning contradictions until he fit the fail-safe like a key in a lock, relief and mourning braided into one. He could not locate the angry young man who had once signed his name beside the words bridge candidate. He could summon instead the voice of a laughing sister and the precise burn of a wound that had made her memory undeniable. The victory tasted ambivalent, sweet in the mouths of the living, expensive in the pockets of the past. He had chosen an act that was both violence and mercy. The aftertaste was the knowledge that, to save a world, he had surrendered parts of the script that had once told him who he was. As the chamber settled into exhausted quiet, Silas stood with his hand on the rim of the seam and let the swarm cool its hum. He knew the future would still ask of him impossible things, that there would be others who would resent a bridge built of blood and promises. He also knew, with an honesty that no archive could relinquish, that when the night came, and his mind reached blindly for the names of people who had shaped him, the one face that remained radiant and raw would be the small, sardonic laugh of the sister he had tried to save, and that the sweep of that memory would now, forever, be the seal that held a fragile new ethic in place. Its slowing pull back on the grid, the medic shouted into the static scrape of the field net, and the sound of 100 tiny motors quitting at once was like someone releasing a breath they had been holding for years. Silas felt the change before he saw it. The chorus under his skin shifted from a straining crescendo to a purposeful cadence, as if an orchestra had been handed a new score, Above the seam, a silver mist unfurled, and then, with a grace that made the survivors around him start and look skyward, the nanobots dispersed into the thinning air and rode the currents like migrating seeds. Around him, the chamber was a mess of torn polyester, torn wires, and the quieting moans of men and women who had been both predators and prey for the last reckless hours. Some still clutched weapons with fingers that trembled. Others simply sat and let their shoulders slide down the walls of the world. The hybrid leader lay motionless a few paces away, her synthetic tendons slack, the human edges of her face oddly pale. Someone wrapped a rag over her mouth. No one dared say she might still be human inside. Mara moved among them like a magistrate and a mother, barking orders, offering water, setting boundaries. Her eyes met Silas's, and for a long moment she held him there, waiting, measuring. The ledger in her expression, more complicated than any ledger on a page. "Are the filters online?" he asked, because words eased his hands. "They are," Mara said. She had a bandage at her temple and a smear of ash across her cheek. The swarm rerouted the power to the old filtration matrix. The ex-scientist's patch got through. "We're stabilizing the atmosphere for the valley. But there are casualties. We lost 12 in the outer guard," and her voice broke like a tide. She swallowed. "Some of the cultists, many more are alive." Silas let the news settle. He had anticipated death. He had not expected the way the absence of immediate blood would make the world feel hollow and real at once. He walked among the injured with his lattice arm folded against his ribs, feeling the odd way his own fingers sang slightly as they brushed a fabric or a human wrist. Where the living metal showed, thin veins of lattice glinted like frost under skin. In certain light his voice resonated with a subtle harmonic, a small chorus undertone that made words catch in others' ears like a chord that begged for agreement. The immediate outcomes unfolded in patient, painful increments. The seam, the antenna, the cathedral of their nearly fulfilled plan, had been rewritten by the code he had grafted into the hive. Rather than broadcasting a compulsive assimilation, the nanobots acknowledged a new ethical overlay. Consent first, repair prioritized, coercion forbidden. The plume that had risen, silver and hungry, paused, reoriented, and then began to carry a different program into the world. It bound toxins into inert lattices that rained harmlessly down, and then bloomed into catalysts that cracked pernicious compounds into useful substrates, where acid-laden clouds had once eaten the skin off metal. Little ozone pockets stitched themselves into the upper airs, pockets that would give the surface slow respite. On the ground, the swarm burrowed into pocked soil and catalyzed microbial hosts, seeding at first a fragile crust of lichen and fungus that began to hold water when it had never before. The cult's forced assimilation had failed the way a plan fails when its architect underestimates the immutability of human hesitation. Many hybrids, their tendons braided with polymers and their spines threaded with code, felt the collective change and found the alien directives unwound. Flesh crawled where implants had clung, and several people, some who had chosen the change, some pressed into it, felt biological selfhood return in halting parts. It was not a clean reversal. Some implants would never be wholly rejected, and tissue grafts that had been given years to knit would not simply dissolve. But in many, a heart's rhythm that had been regular under the cult's pacification stuttered and began to choose again. There were casualties. Zealots who had refused any kind of mercy died in the last stand, and defenders paid with broken bones and hollowed lungs. Some of the hybrids were patched and tended by Mara's medics. Others staggered away under moonlight, their hands still trying to remember how to close without the mechanical precision that had replaced instinct. A handful of innocents, people who had come to the convergence desperate for reprieve, suffered side effects from abrupt deprogramming. Seizures, agonizing flashes of memory that had been grafted into them, phantom harmonics in their speech. But most survived. The longer-term work would be to restore autonomy to those who had had it taken. And it was work Mara and the ex-scientist insisted needed deliberation and consent. Silas felt the consequences in his own flesh more acutely than the others. Portions of his body remained latticework, intricate and exposed in ways that made children look, then step back. His right forearm was a visible tribute to the seam, strands of living metal threaded through muscle. Nodes that could tighten into clamps or fold into serrated edges. When he spoke the chorus that lived with him, sometimes filtered his vowels into a layered timbre. At times his voice carried a second, almost sympathetic tone, an undertone that sounded like the whispers of the network he had helped shape. People reacted to it with fascination and wariness, and both warmed and cooled the room around him. Psychologically, he was quieter than he had expected to be. The anchor he had set, the vow that had reoriented the swarm, sat like a lodestone in the architecture of the hive, and as designed. Demanded memory. It preserved the core image he had etched to bind the code. The small sardonic laugh of a sister in a corridor gone to ash, the taste of copper in his mouth as a child's breath grew thin. But in the act of pruning contradiction from the swarm's decision matrices, parts of his past had been excised. Names, arguments, the precise litany of ethics meetings in some lab he had once believed in, those things blurred and thinned. Most painfully, the exact contours of his sister's final words, her cadence. The small turn of a phrase she had used slipped like water through cupped hands. He could summon the shape of her face, the way sunlight had struck her cheek once. He could recall the vow he had spoken in the seam with microscopic, evangelical clarity. He could not call back with fidelity the small last sentence she had whispered to him. It was an odd, small cruelty. He felt peace where guilt had once burned. But the peace did not arrive through the warm embrace of remembered absolution. It was a procedural peace. He knew he had saved people, and he knew he had acted in a way that prevented a coercive remapping of the planet. But the memory that might have made him wholly human, his sister's final sentence, was diffuse. A glitter that showed at the edges of his mind, without ever falling whole into his lap. Sometimes in the quiet, he could almost swear he remembered a syllable, a clipped laugh. At other times his hands fumbled for a phrase and found only the thin, adamant vow carved into the hive, not without asking. The settlement's social aftermath was messy and earnest. Mara called for a gathering in the communal hall, and the room filled with impulse and ordinance, fear and hope braided together. The question was not whether Silas had saved them. That fact hung in everyone's throat. The question was a moral one. Had he played God? Had he assumed a right that no one should hold? People argued in stretched phrases and short, furious sentences. Some called him Savior, the man who had sacrificed his name to save many. Others labeled him weapon, a living tool that could be misused the minute patience thinned. Mara presided with that old ledger she carried in her eyes. She proposed a democratic process, a council to decide the future of the Nanobot network, a framework of consent and oversight to regulate any further use. The debate spilled into ballots and committees. The settlement began, halting and beautiful, the awkward work of governance. They set up multi-layered protocols. No broadcast without unanimous village consent for pilot regions, recovery programs designed and overseen by a panel of scientists, ethicists, and citizens. The ex-scientist offered to head rehabilitation for former adherents, her hands scarred by work and guilt but steady. She set up modulated neural pools where people could learn to opt into or out of symbiosis on their terms, slow programs that taught the brain to accept the presence of nanites or to encourage their atrophy. Recovery was small, stubborn, human. Silas watched a woman he had seen in the communal pool days before, cheeks still threaded with a thin seam, return to a life where she once again learned how to knit with her own hands. A former defender who had taken implants to fight for the cult now sat and painted chips of reconstituted ceramic with slow, intentional strokes. His hands shook, and sometimes the chorus tried to overlay a smoother motion. But he fought it and learned the messy arcs of humanity again. Children, curious and less burdened with politics, toddled around lattice limbs with the indifference that made adults weep quietly later. There were side effects to the reprogramming that no one had anticipated. Some nanobots, in the rush to obey the anchor's ethic, had cut away from certain implanted control signals, but had left residual nodes that caused cognitive lag. A few people experienced days of flatness, moods attenuated as the swarm refined and rewired associative anchors. Most improved with therapy, with time, with rites of storytelling that the settlement instituted to help people recombine their fragmented pasts. The ex-scientist ran those circles too, her voice patient, her hands always needing to touch something real, paper, fabric, breath. Silas's own days became a series of small human tasks. Teaching scavengers to calibrate filters to the new patches of ozone, helping Mara rewrite the ledger with humility, sitting in council meetings where other people argued about consent with a fervor that would have once made him impatient. He learned to listen. The final, humanizing scene came on a morning washed in pale blue air. The first green patch that the nanobots had coaxed into being was a modest thing. A square of lichen that peeked stubbornly from a crack between two burned slabs. It glowed under the filtered sky, as if embarrassed to be alive. Children had taped tiny flags around it to mark celebration. Silas walked toward it alone, his lattice arm bare to the sun. People watched from the doorway, reverent and wary as if approaching a relic in a shrine. He knelt and reached out. The lichen was cool and gentle under the pad of his finger, a tiny softness that asked nothing and gave everything. He closed his eyes. For one breath, a flicker passed through him, the laugh of his sister not as a memory but as a weather in his bones. Warm and sharp and heartbreakingly immediate, it lasted less than a blink. A stutter of sound that rolled through him and left a soft ache like the pressure in a healed wound. He smiled then, a small, private thing, and when he rose the people around him let out a sound that was half cry, half laughter. He did not reclaim what had been lost. He could not speak the exact words his sister had whispered. That contour was smoothed away. He had traded the fidelity of his past for a world that might survive. Yet in the choice he had made he found a form of meaning that was not memory alone, action. Not without asking, he murmured to himself, and then louder so the children near the lichen could hear, "We will ask." The phrase sounded different coming from him now. It had the weight of the seam, the authority of his sacrifice, the vulnerability of a man who had lost much. People around him repeated it, a chorus in its own right. The plantation that would make a planet living again would be slow. Years of patient catalysis lay ahead, weather waiting, microbes rebuilding soil, ozone healing the upper breath of the world. There would be contests. The old cartels of scavengers would try to harvest the nanobots' utility for profit. Other settlements might choose a different path. Silas knew the recovery would be contested, messy, political. He also knew the small, human truth he had been forced to learn. Survival sometimes demanded surrender, not as weakness, but as a negotiated trade. He had surrendered parts of his past so others could keep their future. When he turned to walk away, the sun threw his lattice arm into a patchwork silhouette. He moved slowly, partly human, partly machine, entirely purposeful. His shoulders carried the look of a man who had been altered by grief and choice. His face now bore the calm of someone who had decided to shape the future. Behind him, vines would climb old walls in imperceptible increments. In front of him, the horizon was a flat nothing that would become something, because people would ask and choose between the options laid before them. Silas walked toward that horizon. He was both the weapon and the salvation the settlement had feared and revered. He had made violence into mercy with the only instrument he had, his body and the stubborn ethics it now carried. The ending was ambiguous and humane. There would be no tidy absolution, no tidy list of debts repaid. Memory would remain mutable. Technology would continue to wound and to heal. But there, in the thin green between the slabs, and in the repeated democratic vow he had helped seed, life had a chance, messy, fragile and human,